Hello and welcome to the SoundStage Audiophile Podcast. In this second season of the show, host Jorden Guth is joined by a new guest each episode who knows something about hi-fi that Jorden doesn't. And who knows, while he's learning about all of this, you might learn something too. So with no further ado, here's Jorden and this week's guest.
Hello and welcome to the SoundStage Audiophile Podcast. Today our show is with the producer of the podcast, as well as the SoundStage Access editor, Dennis Berger. Hey, Dennis.
Hey, Jorden. How's it going? I'm both of those things.
You very much are. You're the man behind the curtain when it comes to making this podcast a reality. Spending
does that mean
countless
people
hours.
shouldn't pay attention to me?
No, I mean...
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
You make it all happen, and maybe I should actually give a shout out because these episodes end up being about 45 minutes to an hour or so, but it actually takes you probably closer to 20, 30 hours of actual editing to get them to that.
It depends on the episode. Sometimes it's 10 to 12, sometimes it's 14, 15. I think the one that we did with some audio was closer to 35. Yeah, so it just depends on the elements, how the recording comes out, how good people's microphones are and all of that. And also how many times they say
Yeah, and I say quite a bit. I may also say a little bit. My Canadian does show off from time to time, so
no way.
Yeah, I apologize for that in your editing suite.
So what am I doing here today?
What are you doing here today? So today, you recently released an article on SoundStage Access. It had my brain spinning with a bunch of different questions.
Okay.
The article is the needs of the many versus the needs of the reviewer.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to give me a quick synopsis of what this article is about? And then we can start kind of jumping into some of the content.
Let's see. How do I sum this all up in one pithy sentence? Well, I mean, basically, let me just give you the gist. The gist of it is that I often get emails from readers who sort of love to say, haha, you don't practice what you preach, or, why don't you do this, or why don't you do that? And, I've had a few back and forth conversations with these readers that sort of explain, well, I can't necessarily do what I believe to be optimal in terms of sound reproduction in my system, because then that limits how I can review other products. And my job is not to say, here is what I like or here is what I dislike. My job is to give people enough information to say, well, this product is for me or this product isn't for me. And to be able to do that, I've got to have a pretty flexible sound system, which is not necessarily the sound system that I would have if I were just an enthusiast. So I decided to write an article about it.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of questions that started spinning in my head when I was reading through this, because it touches on a bunch of different things that I'm still a little confused about and I'm curious about. And I feel like a lot of other people would be too.
Okay.
Let's just start. And I'll kind of set the stage a little bit here. When we're talking about sound systems, you have a set of speakers at home. You have electronics at home, individual electronics and combined electronics, to allow you to test not only, let's say, a new set of speakers that come through, but also different electronics or amps or whatever may come through that interests you to then write about.
Yeah.
Now, when people are actually reading a review, you may, let's say, swap out your speakers for the speakers that you're reviewing, or you may swap out another piece of your system, let's say a DAC for a DAC that you're reviewing. Mm-hmm. But you essentially keep all of these components around to give you a good base from which you can review the specific component that you're talking about.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, a lot of times it's not intentional. It's just over a quarter century of doing this, I've accumulated a lot of gear from either companies who just would not take it back or went out of business or something like that. So I try to always have at least one tower speaker system, big three-way tower, which my Paradigm Studio 100s are some of my favorite speakers ever made. I try to keep a decent bookshelf speaker around. I try to always have a good subwoofer around, at least a few integrated amps and things like that. And yeah, it's just so I can give the reader as much information as I can about this product, right? If I am dealing with an amp that has bass management capabilities, I'm not fully evaluating that product if I only connect it to a pair of tower speakers, right? I need to connect some bookshelf speakers and a sub. How does this bass management work, right? But also, one of the things I talk about in the article is I personally believe that most people would be, and this is true for me too, I think my system would be better if it were 2 bookshelf speakers and 2 subwoofers, right?
Yeah.
But that is not a taxing a load on an amplifier as 2 large tower speakers, right? So I always connect 2 large tower speakers to any amp I'm reviewing, just to let those people who do have large tower speakers know, is this thing going to work for me or isn't it? So even though the 2.2 system would be my preference, I would be doing a disservice to my reader if those are the only speakers that I ever used.
Yeah. And like in the article, you mentioned the idea that, the best system in your mind could be, like, if you didn't have to do reviews, let's say, the best system could be a pair of KEF LS60 speakers.
Yeah. I mean, if I retired tomorrow and built up a nice little nest egg, that would probably be my sound system. Yeah. A pair of LS60s and my phone. I mean, that would just be perfect. That's all I would ever need. But Gord, who runs, he's the editor of SoundStage Simplify, which is a site all about sort of connected audio and things like that. He bought a pair of LS60s, and well, I mean, that makes it more difficult to test an amplifier. Like, what is he going to do with an amplifier now? He doesn't need an amplifier, So that does in some ways limit his ability to review certain products. Now, his website, luckily, the focus of it means, well, that's not so much a problem. Yeah. But my site, Access, man, if I couldn't review amps, then kind of
that's a whole lot of technology. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right.
And this kind of like had me when I was reading this, the first thing I thought of is, does that mean that there are some products out there that might not get reviewed or reviewed as fully because of that? And the example that, I'm going to say the LS60s, like, do the LS60s get as reviewed because people may not want to review them because there's not the other components that they can then swap in and out and kind of test with? Like, do you think that actually limits some of the visibility? The other system that I'll give you as an example is the Dutch and Dutch speakers, right?
Yeah.
They're fully active. When we had Martin on the podcast, we were talking about the idea that a lot of people kind of consolidate their bigger systems into these Dutch and Dutch speakers. And then we actually had some people randomly on a Facebook group say that after listening to the podcast, they sold their entire system and went to these Dutch and Dutch speakers.
Right.
Is that something that, as a reviewer, you might shy away from them? You might say, like, I don't want to review them, or I might not want to look at them because it will then limit what else I can use in that review or use to kind of compare them with?
I would say no. I mean, I believe Diego Estan reviewed the Dutch and Dutch 8C for SoundStage. I mean, look, the vast majority of products that come through my door are back out the door within a month, right? So you can do a review of a self-contained system like that, right? You could do a review of the LS60. You can do a review of the Dutch and Dutch, but then you're probably never going to use those products in another review, right? I mean, what are you going to connect to the Dutch and Dutch to say? Are you going to? I'm going to review this DAC, and the speakers I'm using are the Dutch and Dutch 8C. Well, no. That's unnecessary. Same with the LS60. I mean, what are you going to connect to that thing? Maybe you could review turntables, but maybe you could review others. Oh, God. Yeah.
I just had to. I'm sorry.
I know.
But like when I was reading it, that's kind of what I thought of. Like, do some of these products either not get as full of a shake, or does it become one of those things where a reviewer might say, I don't want to take apart my entire other system to throw in these fully self-contained units that I'm then going to have to pull out again in a month? Like, that's kind of a little bit of extra workload on the reviewer in my mind.
I don't know. It wouldn't be for me, but I'll tell you where I think it is a factor. I think, and I've said this before, and it may have been on my other podcast where I said this, but like, I don't view my job as a reviewer as having anything to do with me saying, I like this product or I dislike this product. To me, the highest praise that I could ever receive from a reader would be for them to say, I know you liked that thing, but you gave me enough information to know that I wouldn't like it, or vice versa. Yeah. I know you didn't like it, but you gave me enough information to know that I would like it. I think, unfortunately, that is not the normal attitude amongst reviewers. And I think a lot of reviewers are simply there to say, I deem this to be a system that you should buy, and you should buy it because I like it. And you know, look, a lot of people like reviews like that. A lot of people like reviewers like that. They like the gurus, but that's just not me. That's not my mentality. And I kind of don't think that attitude is wholly compatible with SoundStage either, the whole SoundStage network. You know, we are a collection of little fiefdoms, right? Yep. I decide what happens on Access. Gord decides what happens on Simplify. But there is still, you know, our captain, Doug Schneider, does set the tone, and he does set, I think, the philosophy. And I just don't think there's a lot of room on SoundStage for the guru types, the people to say, you should buy this because I like it, or you should not buy this because I don't like it. So I think if we were that type of publication, that would impede our ability to review something like the LS6G or the Dutch and Dutch system. But because it's not about us, it's never about us. Yeah. Well, yeah, this is a product that people want to know. So heck yeah, get it in and, you know, put on your big boy pants and take your system apart. You can put it back together, you know?
And I just want to comment on your exact point. One of the things that Doug often says to myself, to Chris, related to the video stuff or the podcast stuff or anything in general, is it's not about us. It has nothing to do with us. Like, correct. What we're doing is maybe showing what is out there, telling a company story or a product story from our point of view, but not making it about us. It's not how we interpret things. It's, this is what it is. We want to share it, and you could take it and love it or take it and hate it, and that's totally fine.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a really good way to put it.
With that in mind, one of the other things in the article that you mentioned, and it also kind of had me thinking through this, is you mentioned this idea of your reference gear. And some people might not even know what reference gear is. And the reason why I kind of want to bring this up is I have an idea of what reference gear is, but I think a lot of my confusion in this is the muddying of waters and having reference be almost like a marketing buzzword for either a series of speakers or a specific model of component or something like that. Mm-hmm. I kind of want to say what I believe the definition of a reference product is.
Oh, sure.
And then I want you to correct me and tell me, you got this wrong. This is what we mean.
Or maybe it's just I have a different idea and they're both valid. But like, shoot, give it to me. What do you think?
So the way that I think about reference products is a reference product, one, is a reference to the individual. I don't think it's a reference to the larger audience per se. And it is what gives the individual a baseline from which to compare the next product or element of something. Mm. And the example that I'll give you is, for myself, I'm wearing these headphones right now. These Sony, whatever they are. Can't read it off the webcam.
Are those 7506s you're wearing?
The 7508s. 7508s.
Oh, 7508. Okay, good deal.
And these, I consider these a reference component. And the reason why I consider them a reference component is because for me, I know exactly how they sound. I've been using them for years. And they are a good base for, I will say, like a clean headphone. And I think to back that up, they're kind of an established industry standard that a lot of people say this is kind of an even playing field from which you can understand other pieces. So what are your thoughts on that? Am I totally off on the reference idea? They don't have a name.
No.
They don't say reference on them.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. But I'll tell you what reference means to me. And you gave a specific example. So I'll give a specific example. My beloved Paradigm Studio 100s, tower speakers. I've spent so much time with these speakers and I understand their electrical characteristics. I understand their impedance curve. I understand their electrical phase. And so I know when I plug an amplifier into these speakers, if that amplifier has a really low damping factor, right? I know what it's going to make these speakers sound like. If it has a power supply that is not up to snuff, I know what it's going to do to the sound of these speakers. So in a sense, it is removing variables, right? I can listen to an amplifier through these speakers and go, oh, the output impedance is not what it needs to be, or the, power supply is not sufficient, or it doesn't have enough capacitance. And so I can start to make assessments about the amplifier because of that. And also, therefore, I can say, okay, so if you've got a pair of bookshelf speakers, maybe this isn't a problem. Or I can hear other things that might be a problem no matter what speakers you have. Do you know what I mean? So it's like a sound system is about the relationship between the amplifier and the speaker. It's a whole system that functions together, right? Well, if I know one half of the equation and I plug something else in, then I start to understand the other half of the equation better. And to me, that's what reference gear means. I know how it behaves. And so therefore, when I put another piece of gear into my system, I have a better understanding of that piece of gear because I know how it's going to affect my reference gear.
Yep.
Electrically, whatever, So yeah, that's reference to me.
So that kind of makes me think about the idea of a reference piece of gear being to the individual. Because it's your relationship with those speakers, it's your use of those speakers over an extended period of time that has you understand those speakers' characteristics so well that you can judge other components based on that speaker set.
Yeah. And you could talk to other reviewers and go, hey, this speaker is good at finding these problems. And, or this, I think a lot of the community knows, a lot of the more scientifically minded community knows certain products and will share information about how they behave. And it's all about making sure that I'm able to better inform my readers. So why wouldn't I want to share that with another reviewer? Why wouldn't I want to say, hey, by the way, if you use this as part of your reference system, it allows you to understand this. Yeah. And that is very important for people who don't measure. I don't measure speakers. I don't measure electronics. And that is one of my weaknesses, right?
Sure.
But, we have Diego for the electronics measurements. We have, Doug going to the NRC for the speaker measurements. So that's covered. But I don't get to see those measurements until 2 months after I've written the review. Yeah. In fact, I don't get to see those measurements until literally you see them, right? Because generally they're published the day the review goes live. So I might get to see a review laid out 5 days before it's published, and I get to go through it and look for typos and all of that stuff. But then the measurements, I see those when the world sees them, right? Yep. So I don't get to look at the output impedance of an amplifier that Diego has measured. I don't get to look at its damping factor. I don't get to look at its, whatever, its total harmonic distortion at a certain output. So if I understand my speakers better, and if I'm not constantly swapping speakers, if I've got my reference, then I can start to make some really, really educated guesses about how an amplifier is going to measure, right? And I can work that into my subjective review.
So, and I love all of that. And then it leads me to this question. And I want your take on this, which is companies that use reference in their naming of products. Are they trying to associate the fact that a product is called reference, so it must be of extremely high quality or kind of standards? Or are they hoping that essentially people keep that piece of the system as the standard for which everything else will be cycle through?
That's a good question. I don't have a mind for marketing. I never have. I'll never understand it. But if I had to guess, then I would say they are positioning this as the speaker against which all others should be compared. When we did the episode about transducer measurements, we talked a lot about the Harman target curve for headphones, right? Yeah. Well, that is a reference in a sense, but I think it would be legitimate to call a headphone that perfectly follows the Harman target curve a reference headphone.
Speaker? Oh, yeah, sorry, a reference headphone.
You know?
Yep.
But I think sometimes it's that, and sometimes I think it's just marketing hype. Honestly, so I think it could be both.
And I want to kind of point that out because when I see reference in not just kind of product naming, but also in awards and stuff like that, a reference component, my brain immediately associates that, well, it must be very good, but it might not necessarily be the best at something, but it might allow you to identify characteristics in other components that you need to identify.
Or maybe it's the company just saying that for what we do, this is this is as good as it gets for us.
Yeah.
For now, right?
Yeah.
Maybe not
this
in the future.
This is our benchmark by which everything else is measured above or below.
To reference back to a previous episode, this is our North Star,
Yeah.
So, yeah, could be.
So, with that, let's take a quick little musical interlude, and we'll jump back in right after the break. And welcome back to this episode of the podcast. We are here with Dennis Berger, and we are talking about what goes into reviewing components, which has me kind of thinking about another question, which is this article that we're kind of discussing and is the cornerstone for the discussion today. You get a lot of listener feedback, or I should say reader feedback. And I'd like to know if that's normal, if you actually get a lot of kind of people emailing you and asking you or asking your opinion or disagreeing with you or agreeing with you, and kind of what your thoughts are on that.
The weird thing is, that was the hardest thing for me to adapt to when I joined the SoundStage family. I've been doing this for 25 years now next year or this year.
Wow.
Yeah, we're in 2024 now. I'm going to have to remember to write that on my checks. So yeah, I've been at this for 25 years. No publication that I've ever written for have I gotten a fraction of the reader emails that I get from SoundStage readers. I mean, it was immediate. I took over SoundStage Access, and I'm talking that week, the emails started pouring in. And it is people looking for specific buying advice. It is people giving feedback on reviews. It's people asking for clarifications or explanations. It's people going, aha, I caught you. You made a mistake. So therefore I am better than you. I mean, it runs the gamut, but I don't know what it is about SoundStage that encourages reader feedback. I was really sort of bummed out when I joined the SoundStage family that Access doesn't have comments section. Now I'm very grateful for it because, it takes a little bit of extra effort for people to send find my email address and send an email. But I would say, I have 20 times more email conversations with readers now than I ever have with any publication before. And it's really cool. I actually dig it. So the 1 out of 50 who's a jerk-faced butthead, well, I don't let them get me down because most of it is really positive interaction and really edifying. And it helps me make me a better reviewer, a better writer. because I actually hear from readers what they need, what they want. I get a better sense of why I'm doing this.
What they're curious about, what they like and kind of
what they trip over. You know, let me give you an example. I mentioned this in the article that we're talking about today. I reviewed this amazing stereo receiver from a company called E24. Well, we had them on the podcast. Yeah. So I reviewed this BassX TA1, I think it was. Fantastic stereo receiver, but it's $500, and the power supply was not a hoss. You know, it was, and this thing had really good bass management, and I think the design ethos behind this thing was they intended it to be used with a 2.1 system, right? Well, I hooked my big old Paradigm towers up to it, and it can't deliver sufficient current to really plow through those deep impedance swings. So the bass starts to get a little light. And I described that. And it wasn't to say, oh, you shouldn't buy this amp. It was just like, maybe this amp isn't for you if you've got big 3-way tower speakers, right?
And no sub.
Right. And so I got an email from a reader who said, hey, have you heard the step-up model, the TA2? And do you think it would have the same issues with bass response? And I didn't review the TA2, so I went and looked at the specs. I went and looked at the internals. I looked at the power supply, and I was like, you know what? I think this thing has probably got a beefy enough power supply that I think it is more likely to be able to handle big impedance swings, right? And the guy was like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm asking if you think it has more bass. And it was like, but I just can't. But that's how that works.
Yeah.
Right? You understand? Like somebody's not sitting when they're designing amps going, ooh, I want this one to have more bass and I want this one to have more treble. No, it's a function of the electrical characteristics of the amp and how those electrical characteristics interact with the electromechanical characteristics of your speaker.
Yeah.
So, you know, and so that made me, the reason I mention it is it made me understand I'm not doing a good enough job of explaining to people why one amp speaker combination might have more bass and another might have less bass, right? I think, and far too many reviewers, I think, treat that as an arbitrary distinction. And they never think about the fact they describe an amp and they go, oh, it's dry, it's bass light or whatever.
But never explaining why it's actually
never
bass
explaining
light.
why, because I don't think they understand it, and never trying it with a different speaker that maybe has different electrical mechanical characteristics and saying, is it still true? It goes back to what I said about, like, I know where the bass starts to disappear in my Paradigm towers.
Sure.
If it's not getting enough current, right? I think far too many people don't understand that. And I think far too many of us who do understand it don't do a good enough job of explaining it. So I love getting that kind of feedback because it lets me know where I need to be what I would consider to be redundant. You know, sometimes you just have to say things twice. And I hate saying things twice, right? But it's making me realize sometimes you need to reiterate stuff or it just kind of doesn't register with the reader.
So you kind of touched on something that's really interesting to me, which is this idea that you also don't necessarily know where everyone is coming into your articles from and what level of knowledge they have.
Correct.
So, for instance, like somebody just getting into hi-fi, if you had me on reading one of your articles, I might not know any of this stuff. You might be saying stuff that I'm like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And there's obviously going to be a balance there in how you write, where how much do you explain in each article and how much do you reference to other articles that explain certain things? It's kind of a question of what level of audience are you speaking to? And that's very hard to know unless you actually get that feedback.
I am trying to take a lesson from, well, this is funny. This came up a few episodes ago when we were talking, or you were talking to the guys at Sim Audio. The issue of this amazing show, Baumgartner Restoration, came up because Sim Audio had advertised on Baumgartner Restoration. So it's one of my favorite shows in the world. It's just amazing. And every episode, Julian Baumgartner, who is, I think, the largest private art conservator in the United States, restores a different work of art, right? And the funny thing about it is every single time he explains his process. right?
Every time.
Every single time he explains, oh, I'm going to face this painting with washikozo paper. Here's what washikozo paper is. Here's why I face the painting. And he explains the same process over and over again. Now, occasionally, if there's something different, if he's not going to face the painting with washikozo, he will explain it anyway. But he treats every episode of his show as if it is the
self-contained lesson.
Well, as if it is the first episode of his show that anybody's ever seen. But here's the trick. He makes it engaging enough to where if you've seen 45 of his shows and you already know exactly what washikozo paper is, and you know why he faces a painting, and you know why he hates staples, right? You would think that that would get boring hearing him explain it again, but it doesn't. He does it in such an engaging way. And that's what I'm trying to learn to do, to constantly re-explain the fundamentals in the hopes that somebody who's reading this review, this is the first hi-fi review they've ever read. But the trick is, how do you do that without boring the people who've been reading your stuff for years, right? That's something that I'm struggling with really, really hard right now. But I think it's a lesson I've got to learn, and I'm looking to Julian for inspiration on that.
That is, that's an amazing place to strive for, right? Like, how do you say something in a way that you're not disrespecting people that already know it? You're not like
or insulting them.
Exactly. Yeah. Like dumbing it down and being like you don't know this. Like, yeah, that's a very fine balance. And it's funny that you bring up the sim audio bit, and we're talking about user feedback. I got some like very direct feedback on that episode, and I think. Maybe I'll say it this way. I from time to time I get feedback on the episodes from either listeners to staff to industry people to Doug and you and whatever. So yeah. I try and take all feedback and absorb it and see kind of what learnings I can take out of it. I try and have a very thick skin with things because realistically, I believe that people genuinely, if they take the time to say something, they believe there's value in it. I don't think of things immediately as negative. The feedback I got on that show was essentially, I did not ask enough about the individual products before I spoke to the overarching thought process of creating that Sim Audio North collection, that entire series of products. And it was hard feedback to listen to at first, because I'm like, there is other elements on the SoundStage network. There's the YouTube video, there's reviews and all this other stuff that goes into that. But I didn't talk about that in the podcast. I went right in to what I was finding interesting, which was this idea that a company like Sim Audio would be kind of brave enough to say, we're going to stop selling all of these other pieces and focus on 6 new products.
Yeah. And somebody took you to task for maybe jumping ahead and not pre-explaining enough, or assuming that they had seen the videos or read the articles on our website or something like that. Yeah,
exactly. And the feedback was direct, and I had to kind of take it and I had to look at it, and absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and apologize if I did not do that, but it is something that I then take and say, well, when I'm doing some of these podcasts, it's not necessarily about me. It isn't about me at all. It's about kind of explaining some of these things that I may look at and find interesting, and it might be generally appealing to a larger audience, but to keep some of these additional things in mind, that not everyone knows all the product ranges of all these different companies that we're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, look, here's my philosophy. The philosophy that I try to live by. So often you will go back and read your old work. Maybe you need to reference a review that you wrote 2 years ago or what have you. And a lot of times there's a tendency to look back at something and be embarrassed by it. And oh God, I could have done that better, whatever. I have decided I'm going to view that as a good thing. If I don't look back at a piece that I wrote 2 years ago and grimace a little bit, then that doesn't mean that I've gotten better. And my goal is to be, anything I write today, progress. I want to look at it a year from now and be a little bit embarrassed by it,
Sure. I love that. That is your reference by which you're expanding yourself.
Look at you tying it back to the earlier conversation. I'm so proud of you right now.
Oh, there we go. So, and maybe that was too far of a tangent, but I guess by the sounds of what you're saying, and I kind of want to reiterate my own view on this, which is I love having that feedback because it gives me the maybe unconscious, I'm trying to be conscious about it, but ideas of the things that I need to kind of mention and talk about to make sure that more people have the relevant information that we hope to bring to them.
Correct. And you know what's funny is I hate to keep ringing this bell, but it just goes back to the guiding philosophy, I think, of our entire network of publications. It ain't about us.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. We've got some really amazing talent in this family of publications. You know, we were talking the other day about AI and sort of the threat about AI because Doug found a review that was written by AI, or he strongly suspected was written by AI. So he decided to go use AI to write a review, and he shared it with all of us writers behind the scenes. And somebody brought up a really good point that it kind of sounds like a lot of the reviews you're going to read it at a lot of the high-end audio publications, right?
Sure.
So we were motivated by it to always do, like, we're trying to do something that AI cannot do. And we brought up, several people mentioned this, like, imagine AI trying to write a review the way Jason Thorpe does. I mean, it would melt the servers because he is such a distinctive personality, you know? I mean, is a force of nature, and, you know, he's passionate and a little bit weird and a little bit rock and roll, man. And, you know, I don't think AI is ever going to be able to do what he does, but
it's
even
the nuance
that,
of human touch.
Even at that, I think Jason would be the first to agree. It ain't about me, man. Like, I'm here to serve my reader, and you can do that and still have the big personality that he's got, and, you know, make the drug references that he makes and talk about riding motorcycles and things like that, and still have the intent of making sure this is about the reader first and foremost.
I love it. I absolutely love it. With that in mind, well, I'm just going to ask you for advice. I'm going to start doing a couple different reviews on select products in the new year.
Ooh.
And and it's going to be a little video series, and we're still kind of working out the details on that. The short version is this has come about just from the learnings that I've been getting as I visit these different companies on the video team and talk to these like incredible people on the podcast. And we're talking about the idea of bringing some of that to reviews to kind of introduce the perspective of a newbie like me in some of these audio products.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of hush-hush little secret that hopefully I didn't spoil too much and I'm not going to get hand slapped for. But
I kind of hope you do. I like being a little dangerous.
I guess with that, what kind of advice do you have? Like, obviously the advice of not making it about you, making it about the others is absolutely great. But what kind of other advice would you share that you see reviewers not do or kind of not do well?
Interesting. You have no idea how poignant this question is. Like, you literally don't know how poignant what you just asked is, because behind the scenes, Doug Schneider and I have been talking about, I am going to write a document that the world is never going to see. This document is only going to be for new SoundStage reviewers, right? And the whole point of this document is me not telling them how to write a review, because I don't think it should be formulaic, but me walking them through my entire thought process when I write a review. Right. And so I've already started on this document. And like I said, it's not for public consumption. Dear listener, I'm sorry, you're never going to read this document, but I'll give you away some of what I've written so far. Starts with the introduction. For me, every time I sit down to write a review, the first thing that pops into my head is, why should anybody want this thing? Right. We in our hobby, I think, have a really, really bad habit of going, well, a company made this product.
So it
they're
must be
selling this
desired.
product. Therefore, it must be something that people want, right? I start with the exact opposite premise. You can get amazing sound with your phone and a pair of good in-ear monitors, right?
Sure.
Which I just committed heresy. A lot of hi-fi writers will never, ever listen to another word that I say again, but it is true. With your smartphone and a good pair of headphones, you can hear all of the sonic nuances in just about any well-recorded piece of music. So when I sit down to review a large speaker or a big amplifier or something that is, let's face it, a lot of people would look at it and go, I don't have room for that, right? But my job is to say, well, is there a reason that you might want it anyway, right? Is there a justification for this thing? And every intro that I write, no matter where it goes, is always, to me, inside my head, not out loud, answering that question. What is this thing? Why should you care, right?
Yeah.
Because I start with the assumption that you shouldn't. And if I come to the conclusion that nevertheless you should, that excitement and energy comes through in what I'm writing, right? Again, you don't say the quiet part out loud. You keep the quiet part in your head. But once you have that answer, that is going to inform your attitude. So typically speaking, that's my introduction. The second part of most reviews is sort of, well, what is this thing like to set up and operate and use, right? Far too many new reviewers that I see. I'm working with a new reviewer now, and he treats it like a diary entry. I did this. I connected this wire. I pushed this button. I did this thing in the app. And it's like, who wants to read that? Yeah. Nobody wants to read that. You should evoke. You should tell a story that gives the reader the sense of what the setup process is like. Because even if they read a review and then they go buy that product, then by the time they start setting it up, they've forgotten exactly what you wrote. Yeah. They're going to forget the details. But you know what?
They don't care about the steps. They care about the feeling.
They're going to remember the impression that you left when you talk about the setup. So again, keep that in mind. Every minute detail doesn't matter unless it does. Sometimes it does. Sometimes a little detail might be a make or break for somebody. And that doesn't mean I come out and say, this is a make or break. It's just, if I know it's going to be a make or break, that's something that I go, okay, it's time for detail because people need this specific information. But other than that, I'm trying to leave them with impressions, right? So typically, after you deal with setup process and things like that, you talk about the performance. And I think this does not apply to SoundStage writers. Maybe it applies to one or two that I've seen, but I still love them anyway. But this applies to far too many hi-fi writers, in my opinion. They look at the performance section and go, "Ooh, I get to share with people what music I'm really into right now." Who freaking cares? Sure. I don't care what you're listening to unless I already think you're cool and you got good taste in music, man. I have several playlists that I listen to the exact same songs every time I review a piece of gear over and over and over again. And the challenge is making sure that I don't repeat that in my reviews. Yeah. But every piece of music in those playlists I have heard sound bad before, right? So often when we think about reference songs, whatever, we think, oh, this song sounds good. This song sounds good. No, every single piece of music that I mention in a review, I've heard sound bad on something, right? Well, why did it sound bad on that piece of gear? Well, does that inform me about something that this piece of gear is doing wrong? Or conversely, does it inform me about what this piece of gear is doing right? If I hear a song that is really hard to make sound good and I play it on an amp or a speaker and it just sounds amazing, I've learned something about that piece of gear that I would not have if I had simply said, what am I in the mood to listen to today? Tchaikovsky's blah, blah, blah movement, whatever, yada, yada. You know, the stereotypical crap that audiophiles are supposed to listen to. The funny thing is, most audiophile music does not tell you jack crap about the performance capabilities of a piece of gear. It's just going to make anything sound good. And that is not helpful or instructive or informative So if you're picking music, pick something that you have heard sound bad before and make sure you can explain why. And then, from there, it's just sort of like, when you're wrapping up the review, what impression do you want to leave people with? And it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. But more than anything else, it's about summing up who is this product for, if anybody, right? Again, that TA1 amplifier, I'm utterly in love with that thing, but it's just not the right amp for some people. And
Sure.
And if you read my review of that amp, the conclusion is glowing, right? And yet I've still, and this is one of the reasons I keep bringing up because I'm really proud of this. I've had people email me and go, hey, you kept me from buying that amp. Thanks. Because it just wouldn't work for me. I know you loved it and that's great, but it just wouldn't be right for me. I did my job. I did my job. What I like and do not like does not matter. And if you're going to be reviewing gear, I hope you remember that.
I love it. I love it all. And the music thing is an interesting piece because the first kind of thought or the thought that came to my mind when you were saying that is this idea of being into audio technology, being into hi-fi, let's say, and having to accept the music of the hi-fi enthusiast, the audiophile persona. And I think that's actually one of the things that as I learn more about high-end audio and kind of reproducing music and all that, there's definitely some audiophiles that kind of fit to that persona. They like those very, I'm going to say obscure, but they're not necessarily obscure. They like those very, very audiophile tracks, but that's not all of audiophiles. Like, people like varying tastes of music. People are not going to always be playing the classical whatever on their speakers. Normal people have a range of music that they'll listen to. Yeah. So it's something to keep in mind. And obviously,
if a piece of gear doesn't sound good with Tool, then it is useless to me, right? I'm serious. I mean, the Tool is one of my favorite bands in the world. And it is just like, I have heard plenty of gear that just, and usually it's an amp with this sort of underbaked power supply that just cannot do justice to Anima, which is, in my opinion, one of the 5 best albums of the last 50 years, right? But I have been attacked before for referencing that album in gear reviews. Like, you can't tell anything about a piece of gear from heavy metal music. Yes, I can. I can tell everything about a piece of gear from heavy metal music, right? I can tell you how your Tchaikovsky blah, blah, blah movement, whatever, is going to sound from listening to Tool. Well, guess what? You can't tell me how Tool is going to sound from listening to your Tchaikovsky movement, whatever, blah, 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 right? So again, it is about giving people the information that they need to. I mean, it doesn't care if Tchaikovsky is your thing. I want you to be able to read my reviews and know how Tchaikovsky is going to sound on that system. But I don't have to listen to Tchaikovsky to be able to tell you that. And I don't really like Tchaikovsky, so I really wouldn't be able to tell you anything to begin with. Go with what you know. Go with what you know.
And that actually kind of leads me to this other idea, which is, and I'm going to say it out loud and you can kind of correct me here, but it's this idea of not judging or not imposing your belief on who the product is made for. Is that the, like, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this.
No, I mean, I generally have a good sense of who the product is for. What I'm trying to do is avoid making that a value judgment, right?
Yeah, maybe I could phrase it this way. Because this idea is in my head and it's like, for instance, I shouldn't suppose that somebody is going to be listening to classical music on whatever, $1,000 set of headphones.
Correct.
Right. But I shouldn't also suppose that they're not.
Correct.
That should be kind of independent of whatever other, I guess it goes back to making assumptions. And it's what assumptions do you choose to make as a reviewer about the gear that will then influence it for better or for worse for the people that may end up being interested in it.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. I don't think that's wrong.
Anyways, switching this up, making it not about me. In closing off this lovely discussion,
Ooh.
I am going to ask a question to you, and we've already kind of asked this before, but you gave me a new way to phrase this. So, Dennis, I just land in Alabama. We're going to jump in a car for a very long road trip. What are you putting on this car stereo system for me to listen to?
Right now, I am positively obsessed with a recording artist named Alice Phoebe Lou.
Alice Phoebe Lou.
She is hard to define, hard to describe. Anybody who listens to my other podcast, Audio Unleashed, has already heard me talk about her. But she describes herself as anti-pop, but it's hard to really pin down what genre she is. There are elements of jazz, there are elements of blues, there are elements of rock, there are elements of punk, there are elements of freak folk. My wife described her as a cross between Patsy Cline and Joanna Newsom with a little bit of Belinda Carlisle sprinkled in. You try to pin her down and her next song is going to completely confound you. But she has this album from a few years ago called Live at Funk House, which I just cannot stop listening to. It ends, I think, or the penultimate track is a song called She, which has actually never been on any of her albums, but she performs it live a lot. And it is just... it's got this driving groove that is animalistic and visceral, and there's just something simultaneously primal and yet delicate and feminine about her work that is almost impossible to describe in a way that somebody can imagine what you're hearing until you just actually played it for them. So I would encourage everybody to check out Alice Phoebe Lou, but specifically Live at Funk House, because I think it's one of the best live albums of the past 10 years, probably.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm adding that to my playlist right now.
Cool.
So with that, thank you so much for taking the kind of hour and so out of your day, Dennis. I love the chat. I'm really looking forward for everyone to kind of read the article that we were talking about, the needs of the many versus the needs of the reviewer. Yeah. And if we didn't kind of get this across, we very much encourage listener and kind of reader feedback. So if you have any feedback on this episode or any of the episodes, please send it our way.
Can I give you a piece of feedback?
Yeah, hit me up.
So people will remember that Brent Butterworth and I used to co-host this podcast in season 1. And when Brent unfortunately had to leave the SoundStage network, not acrimonious, it was very, he's still a friend of the network, but
we had him on the
podcast.
Leave, he was awesome.
We did. But when he left, Doug asked me if I would, find another co-host, and I was like, absolutely not, because I have crippling social anxiety, and Brent is my emotional support human, and there's just nobody in the world that I could have imagined co-hosting a podcast with. But I've been working with you behind the scenes for almost a year now, and you just have a way of making people really, really comfortable. So if it were not you doing the question asking here, there is no way in the world I would have been on this episode of the podcast. So you're really, that is amazing. Really good at it.
I appreciate that so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not good at accepting positive feedback very well, I guess.
Well, your glasses look stupid.
Yeah, there we go. Thanks, Dennis. I'll work on those. Going to the optometrist now. No, but I really appreciate that, and I hope I guess the year is already closed out. So I will say this, the podcast season 2 has been going on for about a year now. Yeah. And one of the things that Doug kind of mentioned when we were talking about this was I seem to just be a very curious-minded person. I ask a lot of questions that I know are dumb or maybe I don't even know that they're dumb, but they are dumb.
Hey, there are no stupid questions, only stupid glasses.
Exactly. And I'm wearing the stupid glasses, and I will continue to, so that everyone else may learn something along the way.
Yeah, but you and I we've got to go woodshed and figure out what the heck we're doing for season 3 to make it distinct, man.
Ooh,
so we're going to be
true.
shaking. Doug wants us to shake things up. He wants season 3 to be distinct from season 2. So we got to figure that out, buddy.
I mean, I like the idea of hosting a podcast from a beach in Fiji. I think that would give the listeners a new perspective of things. So maybe a year-long trip to Fiji to record season 3.
I like it when you say things.
Maybe not. We'll see. Maybe if there's enough listener feedback, we can make it happen.
Yeah, let's get out of here, buddy.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much, Dennis. All the best.
Bye.